My Terrifying Demon Encounter by Ben K. I am 22 years old now, but when this happened, I was 17 years old. I had an extremely terrifying experience that has stayed with me my entire life. I was always getting in trouble when I was a teenager. I was kicked out of 2 high schools, I ran away multiple times, and made life hard for my parents and myself. When this went down, it was the summer, and I was in that I'll do whatever I want mode. One day, my parents called and told me that I had to come home. I didn't want to, so I said, "No way, I want to hang out with my friends." My parents responded, "Well, you can either come home or you can find someplace else to live." So, I did. I asked my friend if I could get a job and live with her in her apartment for a while. She wanted some help with the rent anyway, so she said it was okay. Her apartment, if you could call it that, was the upstairs of a 150-year-old home split into 4 apartments. The building is around 150 years old and has a sign out front from the original owners. It has their names and all that cool stuff on it. I only noticed the sign after I left though. The apartment was spread out, and at the very back of it was the smallest of 3 bedrooms. I made that my room because it was the most private and out of the way. After a while, it turned into the smoke room. The first couple of weeks were enjoyable staying there, and we threw a couple of parties. But after a couple of weeks of staying there, I remember walking home from work one night, and my friend would be gone. I would go in the front door, walk up the wooden stairs to our door, and when I got to the door, the hair always stood up on the back of my neck because I felt like something on the stairs was watching me and didn't want me to be there. Of course, I had to go into my apartment though, regardless of that feeling. I had nowhere else to go, and nothing had happened to me to make me necessarily scared at this point. So, I would go in, get food, and just sit on the couch with my back to the wall until my roommate got home. One night, I mentioned how I was getting creeped out in the apartment, and she said, "Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure it's haunted." She told me that she would often wake up watching TV in the middle of the night, and her miniature dog would just jump off the couch and run into my room. She said the room would be pitch dark, but he would just stand there barking at the ceiling. However, she never saw anything. That was pretty creepy to hear, considering it was my room, so I slept on the couch that night. I fell asleep with her little dog curled up next to me. In the morning, an extremely frightening thing happened to me. I remember waking up to what I thought was a man, or something with a man's voice, laughing very loudly and tauntingly in my ear. I was immediately struck with terror and confusion. I looked into my roommate's bedroom and saw her sleeping on her bed while this was going on. I tried yelling for her but was frozen, and no words came out. I had an overwhelming feeling like all of my energy was just being sucked out of me. On top of what was already happening, the entire house started shaking for a minute. I remember thinking, it's lights out. I know it's the morning, but I can't believe this is happening right now. I think that this attack only lasted for about 2 minutes maximum, and then whatever it was seemed to be sucked right out of the window. It's not that I saw it being sucked out of the window, but I just felt it leave that way. My voice returned after another minute, and I called for my roommate. When she woke up, she said that she had not heard or felt anything. I couldn't believe what had just happened, and I was way too petrified to continue living there. I told a couple of people about my experience, and I was so disturbed that I researched some of the home's history at the library. I honestly did not encounter anything too crazy, but I do believe that whatever attacked me may be a spirit that was unrestful. Or maybe it's some sort of demonic attack. The idea scares me to death, but I'm pretty sure at this point it was something demonic. The Grim Reaper by Anonymous. This happened somewhere around 7 or 8 years ago. I can't recall the exact amount of time that has passed. I was working on this nursing home when I was still in Baltimore, Maryland. I was a new nurse stationed at this skilled unit, they called the vent unit. Now, the patients or residents that stay here look like they are in critical condition with their ventilators attached to their trachea and peg tubes attached to their feeding pumps. Still, they are stable enough to be placed on our unit. Our unit is like a crossroads. I don't know how to describe it, but I'll try. The nurse's station is like the middle and shaped like a circular area where you can see the north, south, east, and west hallways leading to the other units. The north hallway has a dead end that leads to a wall at the far end and nowhere else to go. That side of the hallway always creeps me out, especially during the night shift, and unfortunately, I always work the night shift. One night, it was past midnight already, and the lights were dimmed, but the north hallway was notably darker than the rest, probably because it was a dead end. I was doing my chart checks when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a very tall shadow that just glided toward a resident's room. I was facing the east wing at the time because I didn't want to be facing the dark hallway, and still, it didn't spare me from witnessing something unusual. I did my best. I shrugged it off as my imagination, but I could feel something different. Anyway, since I do most of my rounds in a quarter-hour interval, I went to the north hallway and checked on the patients. I didn't see anything out of the normal, no tall shadows, nothing unusual. So I went to do my duties and just went on with my night. Fast forward the next day, as I came in from my shift that night and I was getting the report, I was surprised that the endorsing nurse told me that the patient in that room had passed away that morning. I immediately recalled the tall shadowy figure I saw out of the corner of my eye that went through that side of the hallway into the rooms at the far end. I wasn't particularly sure which room, but I knew it was near the resident who had passed away. Again, I did my best to pass it off as a coincidence. A few months later, something happened that scared the absolute crap out of me while working there. I was passing out meds sometime past midnight for some scheduled meds on my patients. I was again in the north hallway, and it was pretty dim. Everything was quiet except for some occasional dings and alarms of some vents, but nothing unusual. It was dark as I entered this room since the lights were off, but dim lights were in the hallway behind me. Now the rooms have these expansive windows that are usually covered at night by curtains or blinds, but in this particular room it was wide open. I can't see what's outside since it's pitch black, but the window serves as a mirror since I can see my reflection in the reflection of the hallway behind me when I enter the room. This gives me the creeps until today, and I remember when I entered the room like it just happened to me. I felt like something was behind me. You know that feeling you get when you are being watched, and you feel the hairs on the back of your neck standing up with that prickly sensation all over your body as your heart starts to rise and pound faster? That's exactly what I felt. And what made it worse is when I was trying to search for the room's light switch. I roamed my eyes all over the room while feeling my hand on the wall for the switch, when my eyes landed on the reflection of the window where I saw a tall, shadowy figure standing just behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and as soon as I felt the switch, I turned it on, and the figure was gone from the reflection on the window. I was so freaked out that I never said a word that shift, and just did the rest of my work to occupy my mind. Coworkers ask me to this day why I was so abrupt to leave that day, and honestly, I don't know how to explain it. It's one of those unforgettable moments that I will forever live with. A Dark Veil by Blossoms. My friend's uncle passed away a few weeks ago. I returned to Brazil for his funeral since he was one of the helpers who introduced me to my grandmother's tribe. Not a person from the tribe per se, but something like a tour guide. If it were not for him, I would never have met the same tribe my grandmother was in. For people who do not understand, my grandmother is from a native tribe in Brazil called Taparapa. They are very mysterious and not too open-minded, which means they rarely communicate with outsiders. My friend's uncle was a middle person who allowed me to contact those people. I do not think I became a friend to the tribe, but some elders still remembered my grandmother. During the funeral of my friend's uncle, in the air of sadness, I looked into the casket to say my final goodbye. I could not look into his face directly because I was afraid I would burst out crying. As I looked up and reached his face, I thought I saw a black veil over it. I wondered if anybody else would hide the dead man's face with a black veil. I didn't think that was normal. When I looked again from the corner of my eye, I saw no veil. I whispered to my sister, "Did you see the veil in his face?" My sister said no, and then shushed me. Honestly, I know I saw something strange. It was probably just maybe something tragic, but I did hear on my way out somebody whispering about a black veil lingering over the body. Were we seeing maybe a Grim Reaper? Were we seeing some sort of demon? Or maybe was this just lingering energy from my friend's uncle? A place we were not supposed to find. By Anonymous. This happened in 2013 or 2014, my junior year of high school. I was visiting my girlfriend and her family in Washington, in the Centralia area. We drove up to the BLM roads to do some grilling and shooting. It was spring break, so it was a very gray and very rainy time. While the adults were setting up the grills, my girlfriend and I got into an ATV and went back on the road we came in to do some exploring. We went around a sharp curve in the road, and the wind and rain suddenly stopped. The sky went from gray to gold, and there was a clearing that went from the side of the road to the woods roughly 200 feet away. The light in the sky was not coming from where the sun was at the time, and the space between the trees was much darker than it had been before. We both could tell something was not quite right and was definitely off. I took off my helmet so I could hear better, and there was a sort of whistling/whooping sound coming from a very specific spot in the trees. Now, I couldn't see much of anything, but I knew something could see me, and I could feel that it was not happy that we were there. We turned around and noped the heck out of there as fast as we could. It was kind of like the scene from that movie in Princess Mononoke, where you see the forest spirit for the first time, except very angry. The cherry on top of all this is that we had been gone for about 30 minutes when we got back, but according to my girlfriend's family, we were gone for 3 hours. I know there's something strange in the woods, but I don't know what this was, and it's been burned in my brain for a decade. Found and Lost by Theo Plesha. I don't have a lot of time to get this all typed up and out there. I barely escaped, and they're looking for me. I hope this gets out. If you see it, make sure it goes viral so people know what's really happening. I was the foreman working on Thorngrove, the new elementary school site. I'm going to try to explain this in a way that makes the most sense because it barely makes any sense to me. We were doing shift change and head counts as the graveyard crew left and the morning crew came on. Shane, the night shift supervisor, was having the same problem I was. Some folks weren't showing up when they were supposed to. My problem was less interesting since we got no calls, no shows all the time, but he was having a difficult time locating people on the site. He was blurry-eyed from the night, and I was frustrated because time was just getting wasted. Eventually, we got distracted by some commotion on the far end of the site. We started to trot over to where the yelling was coming from. Then Shane rushed up, his huge cargo pants, and started spilling excuses about trying to settle his daughter down and get her off to school after she lost her beloved stuffed animal. I told him we'd talk about it as my trot became a full-on dash as a cluster of 5 night shift guys were hauling over metallic containers, roughly the size of a 30-quart chest cooler. For all I knew, it was the freaking Ark of the Covenant. Shane and I called for an order while the workers tried to explain what they had found. They said they hit it with their backhoe bucket shuffle. I didn't believe them because the object, though dirty, looked completely intact, and the tines on the bucket would have certainly pierced the strongest metal cooler, unless of course it was solid titanium, which it couldn't be since only 2 men were able to haul it off well over 50 yards seemingly without issue. While I tried to settle them down, the backhoe operator tossed down 2 dirt-encrusted prongs of metal. I instantly recognized them as the metal tines of the backhoe bucket. This object now had my complete attention. They brushed away the dirt on all sides, and although it was silvery like metal, it had more of like a graphite dullness and shapelessness to it. The sides bore no signs of the impact from the shovel, and no markings of any other kind. Construction gloves wiped the top clear in sections. The top part read, Thorn Grove Elementary School Discovery Expansion 2052. One of the workers immediately gasped and said it was a time capsule not to be opened until 2052. Another worker pointed out that it was possibly for a new school they were building, and then Shane chimed in that it was probably an expansion that wasn't in the plans quite yet. One of the workers pointed out the lack of seam or any kind of latch to open this thing. He flipped over the impervious metallic crate. It seemingly moved with ease. He brushed off the bottom, which read, Thorn Grove Elementary School Discovery Expansion 2052. Do not open until 2102. One of the workers, who stood with his arms crossed over his chest and his wrap-around sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, shook his head, saying it had to be a prank. It would have been one hell of an expensive prank, though. It would have been made out of some sort of experimental graphene material to do what it did to the backhoe and remain intact. Either it was an elaborate prank or we're looking at a time capsule, but one from the future. Shane argued his men should open it, but as I already mentioned, the box was solid all the way around, with only markings on the top and bottom. That's when the worker who came in late, Peter Red, took out his phone and started to take pictures. As he circled the box and the other men crowded around, it must have triggered the auto flash on his phone's camera, and something about the flash triggered the box. The top of the box seemed to slither off in quarters onto the 4 corners, revealing a soap bubble-like membrane separating the contents from the open air. The best analogy I could make about the technology and how the capsule opened was that it was unsealed and globed away, like the liquid metal Terminator from Terminator 2. The cooler was filled with all kinds of strange objects. There was something that looked like a Rubik's Cube married to some sort of disc ball roughly 2 inches cubed. There was a collection of 4 cylinders made of material that seemed to be translucent. It's hard to really explain, you know? Each of these things were labeled H2O and ATMOS. I can only guess they were air and water samples from the future. There was a device that vaguely looked like headphones but looked narrower, like it might grip onto someone's neck. I could make out the snowflake symbol on the 2 pads, and I speculated that maybe it was some kind of personal air conditioner. There was a circular item that bore a passing resemblance to a pacifier, but the mouthpiece was hollow, with 2 short hoses that separated out into a lima bean-shaped pad that looked like a combination of an earbud or a foam ear protector. Thoughtlessly, one of the workers reached through the membrane and started to grab the various objects out. One by one, the unusual devices were grabbed or spilled out of the membrane onto the ground and mauled by the workers until the capsule was empty. Then Shane grabbed the box and seemed to lead a mass exodus off the property. We didn't even make it halfway through the parking lot. Some sort of armed forces in black and silver uniforms swamped us. They were clad in some sort of armor, motorcycle-like helmets and reflective visors and respirators. One of them had a red stripe on his chest, and I instantly recognized him as an officer because his head was twisting back and forth. I couldn't hear them communicating, and I assumed somehow they had sealed communication links between them. The officer's helmet, visor, and respiratory gear turned mostly transparent. His eyes were locked with mine, and he started to bark some sort of command. He told us to remain calm and still, that he was declaring a possible biohazardous incident and we couldn't leave until we were cleared. For men who fought their way into diners during COVID lockdowns and thought they won the lottery with tech from the future, This didn't sit well. They started shoving and darting away for a different way out. The officer shouted a command.
"Have it your way. Narcum attentum."
Two of his troopers raised and fired a grenade launcher into the air. The shells split into multiple ping-pong-sized ball spheres that popped like fireworks, dousing us with a white powder that knocked us out cold. All of the crew, Shane, Peter, the 5 others, and I woke up shivering and in pain in an orange tent with bright lights overhead and the sound of rushing air. The entrance of the tent was guarded by 2 heavily armed guards. We were separated from them by a thin inner section of the tent with a transparent airlock liner that reached most of the way around the tent. There were a series of cameras with a sort of reddish spotlight on them. They were periodically scanning over us and relaying medical information like heart rate and O2 levels to a series of monitors on the other side of the airlock. A voice came over a non-existent loudspeaker. It asked us to slowly regain our feet and to take the pills on the table in the middle of the tent if we were feeling anxious or achy. It explained that we were subjected to a fentanyl-based knockout agent similar to what the Russians used in the Moscow theater siege, and Narcan was used to revive us, but the whole experience could result in uncomfortable side effects which the pills could relieve. All of us started to shout to someone to tell us what was going on. The voice said the officer in command would be with us shortly. Indeed, the officer stood in the monitoring section of the tent with his face revealed to us. Something about the material the tent was made of revealed that the face he was displaying was of a false image, which made sense to me because this was some sort of ultra-secret operation. But the fact that no one was actually showing their faces made me feel better about my chances of surviving. In heist movies, you were dead if you showed your face, or whoever saw it was dead. There was no in-between. The officer explained that we had discovered an anti-chrono artifact, basically an object for reasons not explained to us that travels backwards in time. The nature of the artifact and its time period now breached by us had biological considerations. Future strains of the flu, future strains of COVID, future strains of the common cold, or even future novel viruses altogether we may not have even discovered. They were required by code to hold us until any pathogens could be identified and determined if they were infected. Under no circumstances could we leave until that process was complete, because the future of humanity was at stake, allegedly. He assured us that the tent was inescapable and he would not risk letting us go after our first reaction. He said the tent was constructed around us with virtually no contact between us and his men. They told us to stay put, and hopefully we'd make it out alive. We waited for hours. It was probably around noon when the officer came back and addressed me specifically, by name. He insisted he would speak to me. The officer told me something that I still don't fully understand. He said the time capsule was an anti-chrono artifact and was shielding regular chrono effects, essentially carrying them back in time, so long as they remained within the capsule. The capsule's exterior was set to .000001 standard units, which he relayed to me as it would, or in this case should, have only intersected with our perceivable present for 1 hour. He sighed when he said that none of this should have happened, and none of this would have happened if my men had dug in that area about 1 minute before, or about 60 minutes after shift change. The capsule would have been in our future by 60 minutes still, or our past by the smallest unit of time. Either way, it would not have been there at the time we were digging. He continued by saying that something had gone wrong because the time capsule had not disappeared from our present. He said it was stuck, and it was because the time capsule was missing something his men didn't manage to collect while we were on the ground and before the isolation tent went up. He reiterated that, as of now, we had some time. He believed the capsule was stable in our time for at least another hour, but after that he said that something bad was going to happen. He said something like Hitler could win World War II, I could never be born, or the Big Bang Theory might not happen at all. Everything could potentially disappear because something, in that case, needed to keep going back in time. He told me he believed I could figure out and talk to whoever was holding something and maybe get them to surrender it. In the meantime, the officer told me he was running temporal correlations to the incident facets and there was no guarantee they would produce results in the time allotted. He suggested I start asking people with connections to the area, specifically this field before it became the construction site for the school. The alternative was that he'd kill us all and risk contaminating himself to find the object. He said as far as the world, the public, and our families outside of the construction site were concerned, they were informed that there was a hazmat accident on site and that the area was off limits with unknown casualties. Yet he suggested I take any action I deemed necessary to keep it that way. As the officer left, I turned around to see my employees, my family, huddled on the other side of the tent. They lifted their heads and stared me down with suspicion. I respected them. I had been to some of their homes and even met most of their families. We played softball together and spent at least one solid 4th of July getting drunk together. I went to Peter's first child's funeral and was sort of close with his surviving daughter, Maggie. It occurred to me, though, that Peter was a newcomer to the area and had moved here for the project. My suspicions fell on Shane, who had lived here his whole life, but as I thought about it then, I wasn't sure how being local mattered. I gave everyone the cliff notes about what the officer had told me. I omitted certain details, chief among them was the alternative. I was met by loudness, mostly things I would have said. Who are these guys? Really? Who does something like this? How can you even travel back to the past? The experts say a lot of things, etc. I let them exhaust themselves a bit before I straight asked them if anyone kept something they shouldn't have from the box. I reiterated the disease aspect, that if they'd surrendered it now, we could all probably get out of here. I turned to Shane. He told me not to look at him. I told him I had reason to believe he had it. Whatever it was, he swore he only grabbed the capsule itself, and by the time he did, it was empty. It was then that one of the workers, Mac, stepped up and yelled that if they wanted it so bad, they should come in and take it. He got applause from 2 others, including Peter. I told him this wasn't about that. That didn't stop Mac and Peter from taking swings at me. Shane and the other 3 then came and pushed them down and away. When the scuffle was said and done, there was a Beanie Baby-like toy on the floor. It was in the shape of a dachshund. I picked it up and Peter immediately came over to me and tried to look surprised. He said it was his daughter's stuffed animal that she lost, and he must have had it in his cargo pants the whole time. He tried to play it off like he found the toy she lost. I was about to hand it back to him when the stomach opened up and revealed a pouch. Beaming out of the pouch, in the eyes was a bright light and a message that read, "Dad, I finally found it. I wish every single day I made a bigger fit that morning. Love you, Dad, Maggie." I held it for a second and tried to play it off like I hadn't seen the message. Something clicked in my mind, though. Something like when you know you have something horribly gone wrong, or if you have beat somebody in poker really bad but you don't want to show your excitement. I was about to ask Peter if he had been up here before, but I remembered when I brought him on, he said he used to bring his kids to the park nearby where the school was being built, and he was excited to move his family here and have a brand new school for them. Shortly afterwards, his son died. I realized that if I kept going back in time, there was a chance someone in the past might have encountered it and taken something like a stuffed dachshund with an eyeball hologram tech out of it, and maybe kept it. Why didn't it destroy the universe then? I wasn't so sure, but because of that, and I think that's entirely what happened, if it wasn't returned now, it would destroy the universe I was currently in because it would never make it back. It would still be here. I gripped the stuffed animal tightly and tossed it into the mini airlock and sealed it. The medical tech came by with a capsule and made the transfer and carried it out, presumably to be reburied and disappeared from our present and our future. I was bracing myself for Peter to come after me taking his daughter's toy, but instead, I saw Peter break down in tears as he slid down to the end of the tent, sobbing. Then it hit me. "Dad, I finally found it. I wish I made a bigger fit that morning. Love, Maggie." In the future, Maggie would be affiliated in some way with the school's expansion product and the time capsule. The toy she recovered from the park as a younger child was finally made in the future, and she put that message into the capsule. But it was right on time. It couldn't have happened any other way. In under 2 hours, we were released from the quarantine monitoring tent, except Peter. Officially, the hazmat incident was us encountering a pocket of hydrogen sulfide gas while digging. All of us survived, except for Peter. We were compensated for the incident with the stipulation that we never discussed it. Doubts flooded my mind, along with tears. It all started to break down in my head. I was guilty, so I started telling Peter's story, and now they're after me. I hope, if nothing else, people know the story of Peter. West Virginia Spookiness by Brianna B. A neighbor of mine told me a story of how his great-great-grandparents got together. This story won't contain a lot of emotion considering I wasn't there. This isn't my family to get really worked up over, nor did I get many details other than the statements from my friend. And my friend is a pretty straightforward guy. So, Jim and May Hatfield was his grandparents' names. They lived in a small West Virginia town in the early 1900s and late 1800s. Come to think of it, it was so small that over the years, that so-called town has been claimed by the town that was actually next to it, and now it no longer exists. The population is declining. Jim came from a wealthy family who owned almost every log company in northern West Virginia. His family owned nearly half the state, really, and considering his name was Hatfield, I would assume that he is akin to the devil Aunts Hatfield, the main man himself from Hatfield and McCoy. However, it was never stated or confirmed that that was true. This was just an assumption. May lived in a coal mining camp with her other 5 siblings, her mother and father, so May didn't come from a wealthy family by any means. Back then, there wasn't such thing as being rich. Everyone was poor. You see, Jim didn't want to go into the family business of logging, so he went underground to mine coal with a couple of his friends he grew up with, and he happened to work with May's father. After working for a couple of weeks, Jim asked May's father if he could start dating his daughter. May's father agreed to it, and Jim took May on a series of dates over a few months. One day, Jim took May to the dance hall, out to dinner, and their date ended with them at a local bar. Jim got super drunk over the evening, to the point he couldn't stand and he was slurring his words, so much that he asked if May could drive him home. This is when the story takes a truly wild turn. On the way home, a man walks right in front of May, and she can't hit the brakes fast enough. Jim told May to move over into the passenger seat, and he got up, picked up the lifeless body off the road, and put it in the back of his vehicle. Jim then drove down this dirt road until they reached a dead end. I know what you are thinking. Jim was just slurring his words, but now can lift dead weight and drive straight. Well, I don't think you've ever hit someone with a car, but I would assume that adrenaline was enough to knock him sober. When they got to a dead end, Jim told May she needed to follow him up to the mountain and that he had a plan. When they finally got to the top of the mountain, there was a beautiful hand-built cabin that Jim's parents owned when they lived in southern West Virginia. Jim told May she needed to stay there for a couple of weeks because, you see, Jim held a 1909 black Ford Model T. He was only one of 5 people to own a car in the whole county. So eventually, people would notice this man was missing, and if there was any piece of the vehicle in the road from the accident, fingers would start pointing. If the other people who owned vehicles had alibis, then it would come back that May was driving Jim since he was drunk, and she would be charged with murder. Dramatic, I know, but that's what Jim told May, and who knows, maybe he was right. I have watched many crime shows, and they don't normally back up this type of claim. And it is a very Great Gatsby type, if you ask me, but whatever. May agreed and wrote a letter to not only her but also Jim, which made people think he didn't know where she was. So cliche. But anyway, in the letter, she said that she was accompanying one of her friends to Tennessee to visit her family. Her friend didn't want to travel alone, so she would be back in a couple of weeks' time. Very short nod for her parents not to question or even ask about, but whatever, it's a different time, I guess. I'm sure they didn't care or were too busy. This is where details do get a bit fuzzy, so use your imagination. Over time, Jim bought fabric, chickens, and even a cow up to the top of his mountain. It was also rumored that Jim would stay the night with May at the cabin, even though that was a big no back in the day, but I'm sure it was probably just a slumber party kind of sleepover. Jim then told May that there was no talk of the dead man that Jim buried, and she was safe to come back home. When she did, Jim asked her hand in marriage, which she accepted and moved back up to the top of the mountain in that log cabin, since she had everything up there she now needed, and she liked it up there. She felt like the queen of the hill. May found out she was pregnant soon after that and they married. So, one day, she went to a local doctor for a checkup when she saw the man whom she'd hit and killed with her car. When she got back home, she asked Jim about it because she thought he was dead, considering Jim told her he had buried that man and that there was talk around the town. That's why she was hiding for so long. Buckle up, here's where it gets crazy. Jim told her he was just testing her. He planted a man in the road, and instead of hitting the man, threw a big rock which made glass break, metal crumble, all that type of stuff. In a state of shock, May didn't even notice nor ask any questions at the scene of the accident. Jim said since he came from money, he wanted a true, honest woman who could cook, clean, love him, etc., compared to them just using him for money. And if he found that woman, he would definitely marry her. Well, I guess that was some sort of romance because they've been married for 56 years and had 12 children. If being tricked into thinking I killed a man so someone could isolate me just to test my skills for marriage is classified as romance, then I'm glad romance is dead. Isolation Isn't Always Safe by Trailer Park Boys 445. I thought living in an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere would be a dream come true. A chance to get away from it all and enjoy the beauty of nature. But now, I know much better than that. It honestly all started on a dark and stormy night. The wind was howling, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I was sitting by the fire enjoying the warmth when I heard a strange noise coming from outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I started hearing it more often, again and again, and then what sounded like a low growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I looked out the window, but couldn't see anything in the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard another noise, a scratching sound like something was trying to claw its way inside. I went to the door and peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. I cracked the door, shone my flashlight outside, and there was nothing there. I was about to close the door and return to bed when I heard a loud bang like something had hit the roof. I looked up, and to my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, but I knew this wouldn't hold whatever was out there for very long. I could hear it scratching and clawing at the door, trying to get inside desperately. The sound was so loud and terrifying that I thought the door would break at any given second. I huddled by the fire, praying for whatever was outside. I just hoped it would disappear, but it didn't. Instead, it kept scratching and clawing, and I could hear its growls getting louder and more aggressive. It felt like hours had passed, but the creature outside never gave up. I was too scared to sleep, too scared to move, and too scared to even call for help. The sun finally rose and the creature disappeared. I ventured outside and saw the roof had been damaged. The claw marks were all over the door, and I knew I couldn't stay in this cabin any longer. So I packed my things and left, never looking back. Now, whenever I hear a strange noise at night, I can't help but remember that terrifying night in that isolated cabin. A Highway of Nightmares by A.J. I was driving down an empty stretch of road in the middle of nowhere. The sun had set hours ago and the darkness was all-encompassing. The only light came from the headlights of my car, illuminating the road ahead. I had been driving for hours, and the scenery had not changed very much at all. It was desolate and barren with no signs of life for miles around. For some reason, though, I couldn't shake this sense of unease, as if I was not alone on this road. Suddenly, I saw something moving in the distance. I woke up instantly and my heart began to race. It was like a natural energy endorphin. It looked like it was a figure walking towards me in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I could see that it was a man dressed in tattered clothing with a wild look in his eyes. I tried to swerve around him, but he jumped in front of my car, causing me to slam on my brakes. He stood there, staring at me through the windshield, and I could see that his eyes were bloodshot and his face was twisted into a grotesque smile. I tried to back up, but my car was stuck. I was trapped, alone with this deranged man in the middle of nowhere. He started to walk towards me, his pace slow and deliberate. I could hear his breathing, ragged and heavy. I locked the doors and rolled up the windows, but I knew it was useless. He was getting closer, and I could see him now. His skin was mottled and gray, his hair unkempt and greasy. Suddenly, he lunged at my car, pounding his fist on the windows and screaming. I could hear his nails scratching against the glass, and I knew he wanted to break in. I tried to start the car, but it just wouldn't budge. I was trapped with this madman closing in on me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breaths coming in short gasps. Then, just when I thought it was all over, the man, for whatever reason, stopped. He looked at me with these bloodshot eyes, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Then, only did I notice then, there was another car coming down the road. I guess I was so focused on this man I didn't notice them. I got out of my car, and I instantly flagged them down. They helped me get my car turned around, and eventually I drove home. But I can't tell you how it felt in that moment, to feel like you were helpless. And if this car just didn't happen to be driving down the road, I would have been dead. It's honestly good that it worked out this way. But I don't know if other people in the future would be so lucky. Backcountry Voodoo Weirdness by Pickled Salmon 007. I recently heard about a new trail that promised breathtaking views, so I knew I had to check it out. But little did I know, what I would find would leave me scarred for the rest of my life. I eagerly set out on a new hiking trail that promised amazing views and beautiful scenery, but what I found was beyond anything I could have imagined. The course began innocently enough, winding through the trees and up the mountainside. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange. Tied to the trees, along the trail, were animal carcasses rotting in the sun. At first, I thought it was just a few unlucky animals that had died in the wild, but then I saw more and more, all tied up with twine in the same fashion. The smell of death and decay in the air was overwhelming. It was thick and it was making me want to gag. The putrid smell is something that you can't explain unless you've been around a lot of dead animals. As I continued down the trail, the number of animal carcasses increased, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to stalk me. Every rustle of the leaves made me jump, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, and in the center stood a massive tree covered in animal carcasses. The stench was almost unbearable, and the sight was beyond disturbing. The animals hung from the tree like grotesque ornaments, rotting and decaying in the sun. I realized then that I had stumbled upon some sort of sinister, ritualistic killing ground where someone or something was sacrificing animals to some unknown god or force. Fear instantly gripped me, and I tried to back away slowly, but I swear I could feel eyes on me from every direction watching my every move. The forest was eerily silent except for the thud of my heart in my ears. I knew I needed to leave the place immediately, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I forced myself to turn around and run back down that trail, every step taking me further and further from that nightmare. When I finally returned to the trailhead, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The image of those animal carcasses tied to the trees like some twisted offering would forever be seared into my mind. The thought that someone or something was out there, watching me, hunting me, still haunts me. I reported this all to the police, but I'm not sure whatever came of it. Weird Occurrence I Had by Cayman Duelist 01. I had a weird occurrence when I was a teenager, maybe about 15 or 16 years old. I don't remember the exact age. It was sometime in the mid-2000s. I spent almost all of my early to late teenage years in a small town called Cresco in Iowa. So let me set the scene of this story. I woke up early one Sunday morning while it was still dark out. About 5 in the morning to prepare for my paper route job. I got all my stuff ready and into my courier bag to set out for my route, leaving my house to start my career. Once I left my house, I started walking down the sidewalk to the corner of the intersection to the cross street to get to the next road to head north. I have to pass a large 3-story building that I believe used to be an old school at one point, that is now just used for storage for the fitness center that is right next door. I had a weird feeling that something was wrong, and I looked over the opening of the alleyway and saw the most bizarre and creepiest thing ever. Underneath the lamppost, illuminated by the light, was a puddle of darkness. I had no idea what it was. Ooze? I know it wasn't water. It moved and rippled like it, but it just wasn't. I stared at it for a few minutes and decided, nope, not today, and just sped walked the opposite way back to my job. I returned half an hour later while it was still dark out, and it was not there anymore. So what the heck was it? A figment of my imagination? A doorway to hell? Ooze from another world? I don't know. Cresco has had its strange and messed up stuff happen, and definitely has bouts of weirdness going on in that small town on a daily basis. I'm just looking to find answers about it. I once asked a self-proclaimed paranormal investigator about it, and they said it was probably a doorway or something to some sort of other dimension, or possibly just a creature. Halloween Horror by Anonymous. I grew up in rural Iowa, just cornfields for miles and miles. It was a pretty crappy place to grow up. Like, it'll always be home to me, and I'll always have a fair amount of affection for it, but home is where the heart is and all that BS. But even the earliest stage of life that I can remember, I wanted to leave. To put it this way, Halloween has always been my favorite holiday. But unlike the kids who would trick-or-treat in Cedar Rapids or Waterloo, who had actual neighborhoods to harvest whole sacks of candy from, we had to walk about 1.5 miles at a time just to make it to the next house. So aside from the one year when our mom drove us over to Dyersville to get a taste of how those city kids lived, trick-or-treating wasn't really an option for us. So a little backstory. Last year we were allowed to go trick-or-treating. Our immediate neighbor to the east, who lived 3 miles away, told us to go the hell away because we were getting way too big for playing kids games. This guy has begrudgingly given us a few apples some years in past, and we always resented him for it. But that year, when he told us where to go, it made us downright hate him. I mean, the entirety of the following year, me and my brother would scowl whenever my dad drove past this house. To us, he ruined the one good thing we got to do around Halloween each year. I know we were just dumb kids, but kids are also cruel and stubborn occasionally, and I guess we were just that kind of kid. So the following year, my mom decided to take us over to the Living History Farms in Urbandale. Living History Farms is a place near Des Moines that bills itself as an interactive outdoor museum that teaches people about the Midwest rural life experience. Honestly, we were not really thrilled about the visit. It wasn't exactly exciting for two boys in their early teens. I mean, learning about some of the origins of Halloween was pretty cool. I mean, a kid like me was all about hearing how Halloween was the night when spirits of the dead returned to the earth to wreak havoc to those who had wronged them in life. However, there was one particular little educational tidbit that got me and my brother's attention. And that was how our Loan ancestors used Halloween as a night to play pranks on each other. Pulling up cabbages and shrubs out of their gardens was a common trick. Wagons were pushed into the lane or the street. If the kids were ambitious, they'd hoist the cars of the victim onto their barn roof. But the most common mischief was taking your neighbor's garden or barnyard gates off the hinges and leaving them in someone else's yard. I remember the teacher lady telling us, then me and my brother just looking at each other with this wordless kind of communication like, "Oh, the neighbor is going to get it this year." So that year we snuck out of the house in the early morning hours, walked down to the neighbor's place with a screwdriver and a hammer, and did exactly that. We took his front gate off the hinges, walked like 1 mile down the road to his neighbor's place, then left it in the front yard. We did stuff like that for the next couple of years, each time getting more progressively bold, screwing with him harder and harder until it got to the point that we struggled to top the previous year's prank. It got to the point where we stole a considerable section of this white picket fence and just threw it into the cornfield across the highway. We put some work into that, dismantling it piece by piece so as not to make much noise and wake the guy. I mean, it sucked. We never got to hang around to see his reaction. but imagining him going outside in the morning and going insane with rage was enough to keep us amused. So this one year we walked up to his house in the middle of the night and saw something we had never experienced in a million years. This neighbor hated Halloween and never ever put up any decorations or anything. But that year we turned up to see this Grim Reaper on his front porch. It wasn't just some dumb looking scarecrow type thing either, and it seemed like the guy had put in a lot of work getting a hold of actual mannequins or stuff, as well as the spooky looking black robe stuff to dress it in. But since he was a farmer, he did have much trouble getting a hold of the old rusty scythe leaning against it. I mean, yeah, it was kind of intimidating. He had only put it there to try to scare us off, but we weren't about to be removed from our little yearly ritual at this point. Nothing short of a tornado could deter us from getting our revenge for him being so mean to us that Halloween night. But right as we start to dismantle his fence, in almost absolute silence, I notice something out of the corner of my eye. Or rather, I see the lack of something so subtle that it takes me a minute to realize what I wasn't looking at. At some point as we were taking his fence apart, the Grim Reaper statue thing just stood up and disappeared. I stopped what I'm doing, looking around the front yard trying to spot where it could have gone. I whispered to my brother, "The Reaper is gone. Did you see it move?" At first he looked at me kinda like I'm crazy, but then he too starts getting pretty freaked out. We're just crouched down, tools in hand, in dead silence of the night, realizing that we had been a little too overconfident in our yearly pranks. We didn't quite understand what was happening. That's when things went wrong for us. "Let's get out of here," my brother whispered, and we immediately got up and started jogging back towards the highway. Then out of nowhere, the Grim Reaper is standing in front of us, with that giant old rusty scythe in his hand, blocking our escape. It hadn't been a mannequin that was set up on the front porch. It was actually him. He dressed up like some dumb decoration and just stood there still as a statue, waiting for the pranksters to arrive. There was one drawn-out moment when we locked eyes with the guy, who had taken down the hood and black robes he was wearing. Then we just bolted. But since he was blocking the way and the road out front, we had to run back through his property, climbing over a fence and into a cornfield to get away from him. He was fast for an older guy too. Like maybe it was just all the anger from having been victimized year after year, but somehow he wasn't weighed down by the scythe. And those robes, for whatever reason, he opted to keep on, didn't slow him down at all. I was scared, sure, but I figured we'd be able to get away. But remember how I said we had to scale a fence to get away? Hopping down the other side didn't go well for me. I badly sprained my ankle when I landed. That was when I got terrified when I realized I couldn't get away from the guy. My brother kept running, and I wanted to shout after him to help me, but I knew that shout would give away my position to the guy. So I kept my mouth shut. So picture this scene. I'm hiding in the cornfield, so scared that I'm covering my mouth to keep from breathing too heavily, while the furious scythe-armed guy is stalking up and down the rows looking for me. Every so often I had to just limp to a hiding spot further down away from him, trying my best not to rustle any of the stalks so I wouldn't betray my hiding spot. It was the middle of the night, and maybe the guy's eyesight or hearing was failing him, but I managed not to get myself caught. I kept stumbling further and further away until he gave up and headed back to his house. This was completely and utterly terrifying, hearing him say stuff like,
"I'm gonna cut you up into little pieces and feed you to my pigs."
The tone of his voice was telling me he meant every word what he said. So yeah, as you can imagine, I was pretty close to peeing my pants many times, knowing that I just couldn't get away fast enough. Needless to say, we didn't try any more pranks on that guy after that. Hometown Sinister Secret by Gold Star Tank. I grew up in a small town in east central Iowa. At first glance, there isn't much to see. It has only one stoplight on its main road. The downtown area is along the main street and is lined with old buildings from the 1940s. It has a Carnegie Library on the south side of town, and to the west you'll find the fairgrounds and the dirt track. As for the things it is known for, the town doesn't have much. A fantastic county fair that brings in people from all over the state, and a special cream crescent pastry that will keep visitors and townsfolk happy. But that's not why you're here. You want to know what dark and scary things have happened in my hometown's past. For any music lovers, you may be saddened to hear that Buddy Holly and his band had their last meal in my hometown. They had dinner at a diner called the Greasy Spoon before driving north and making their fateful flight into history. My grandmother lived in that town nearly all her life, and said that particular diner was a horrible place and went out of business decades ago. This bit of history is pretty well known among the older population and to those who like to study their town's history. But there is one more thing that is not nearly as well known. If you were to travel to the northwest side of town, you'd find lots of sprawling cornfields and a few old farmhouses dotted around the area. But in the middle of the old cornfield, sitting away from all the other buildings, stands a tall brick building called the Old Cedar County Home. The county home was built in the early 1900s as a poor farm for those less fortunate to have a place to stay and work. However, not everybody liked this idea, and on an opening day, one of the head of staff was attacked by a resident with a pitchfork. The records I have looked through have yet to say whether the poor staff member survived this attack. Later, around the 1930s, the building gained an addition in the form of a mental asylum which soon took its first patients. This particular time was a rough time for everybody in history, and the home's occupants continued to grow until World War II began. After the war, the poor farm side of the house began to diminish while the mental hospital, now called an insane asylum, continued to grow. It was at this time its most atrocious happenings took place. The head nurse of the asylum didn't like her patients very much, especially the insane women who either were or happened to become pregnant while there. The story goes that the nurse would be quite cruel to the pregnant women and make them work outside or do extra chores even though they could barely stand. When it came time to give birth, the nurse would drug the mothers so severely that they would be unconscious, and as soon as the baby was born, the nurse would take the baby away and kill it, later telling the mothers that their baby was stillborn. The nurse was let go after a while, and the home began to fall into hard times, sometime around 2004, when its last residents were transferred elsewhere, and this place was finally closed. A farmer bought the house and the land, but they still stand as a reminder of their cruel past. The locals who do know about it say that it is probably a drug den now, and most agree that it's undoubtedly haunted. As the home is on private property, exploring the remains of the building is challenging unless you want to risk getting arrested or shot at. However, some people have found a way in, shared photos online. Most of them aren't too scary except for one that caught my attention immediately. The words, quote-unquote, "I see you," were spray painted in black. The future of the home is uncertain as the farmer uses the land for storage and has left this place in particular untouched all these years. But one thing is clear, you'll never catch me out there after dark. Small Town, Iowa, by WeG211. A little backstory before we begin. I'm 17 years old, I'm a male, and I live in Iowa, presently residing in a small town, so small that it has to be in parentheses on a map. My county consists of a tight cluster of small towns, each with a seemingly unique niche of people, but it's all just the same picture in a different frame. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to it. I'll try to keep this brief, but there's a lot of ground to cover here. Alright. A buddy of mine, we will call him Dumbo, wound up with his first girlfriend in one of these small towns, then later broke it off and moved to where he currently lives in 7th grade. The two towns are about an hour's drive apart, so fast forward a couple of years to our junior year in high school. At this point, Dumbo and I are 16, and he's shifted through a couple of girls but won't stop talking about his first girlfriend, back in 6th grade. In due time, they get back together, and him driving over to this other small town every Friday becomes regular. He stays a little later every time, and eventually starts spending the night there. On Thursday evening, we learn we won't be having school the following Friday. Dumbo and I stay up too late screwing around on video games, and he heads out at about 2 a.m. He shoots me a text shortly after saying one of his girlfriend's friends needs a date. As a complete geek, I snap at the opportunity, and we head to this small town the following morning. Long story short, it was the most disastrous 6 hours I had had in a long time. I'll spare a lot of the details, so fast forward a few months. Dumbo has since broken up with his girlfriend for unexpected reasons. Apparently she was biting him frequently, always drawing blood. She would call him almost every couple of hours, and I'm told she went berserk when he didn't pick up, leaving many voicemails, sending tons of angry text. She picked up a fascination with Twilight in recent times as well, and that translated a little too much into her real life. Despite this, Dumbo didn't break it off until November of 2014. After the breakup, she still texts him saying how she'll wait for him and all that good stuff and she'll always forgive him. Pretty odd stuff. Still needs to be finished though. Remember that girl I was set up with? She was apparently a bit too physical with Dumbo's girlfriend's sister. Not even just roughing her up a bit. She had to go to court for a R-word case. Dumbo still gets texts from this chick, and I'm told the girl I was set up with quote-unquote misses me, which gives me shivers. This is pretty outlandish and nearly unbelievable, but this is all entirely true. Some people are absolutely insane, and you should be very careful who you set your friends up with, especially if you don't know who they are. Always carry a weapon. By Anonymous. I like to run outside, and I usually have a knife with me just in case. I started doing that after they found Molly's body in Iowa, the runner who was murdered a couple of years ago. Living in the state, it really put me on edge. Well, one day I was in a bad mood, so I went for a walk and didn't think to bring my knife with me. Of course, this was the one time someone tried to bother me. So the setting is a sidewalk between an open field and some apartment buildings. I was walking with my earbuds in, listening to music, and I took a left. I walked a little way down the path and then decided to turn around and go back. When I turned, I saw a man walking towards me. Not that unusual, I guess. I do live in a rather decent-sized town in Iowa, but being on a sidewalk and all, I thought, okay, whatever, pedestrian. I prepared myself for that awkward smile, say hi, and walk by. But as I tried to get around him, I noticed he was trying to talk to me and getting in my way of going around him. I glanced and then tried to ignore him, but he walked back to catch up with me. Annoyed, I removed one earbud and he was rambling about how he wanted to know where I lived, what my name was, and other stuff. I just pointed in a random direction away from my apartment and lied about my name while picking up my pace. Then the guy asked if I was seeing anyone. I said yes, I'm married, and then he started carrying on about how he was sorry and how he didn't want to get in the middle of anything. Sure, because I would leave my husband for some random weirdo on the street. Suddenly, a girl from the apartment building across the street shouted at me and waved her arms, so I ran towards her. The guy hopped in his car, turned around, I assumed he was driving by, and pulled over to follow me, and took off. She asked if he was bothering me, and I said yes and thanked her. I don't know what would have happened if he tried to go beyond this level of creepiness, but I'm a lot more cautious now, and I never forget my knife. A Weird Childhood Encounter by Callie M. Just a disclaimer, I don't really believe in the supernatural. I am a very scientifically minded and driven person, and despite having had many unexplainable experiences, I am not really one to jump to ghosts or monsters. That being said, when there is something that I cannot explain, I just have to respond with, I guess I just don't know the answer this time, but I would like to know more. I'm letting you know now that I am open to ideas or any explanations in the comments. This story takes place in a small town in Indiana. I grew up there, but now I live in New Mexico. I have had quite a few experiences in Indiana, but never anything in New Mexico currently. I was also reasonably young when all of this took place. To give a bit of backstory, I was about 8 years old when this first story took place. So, this would be around 2007. My parents are divorced, my mom lived in New Mexico with my little brother, and I lived in Indiana with my father. At this point in his life, my dad drank often, and he would usually get angry and violent when alcohol was involved. He never hit me or anything like that, but there were bouts of verbal abuse directed at me and my stepsister, and my dad's girlfriend. There were a couple of instances where their alcohol-fueled fights got kinda physical as well. The point of mentioning this is that I was already under stress. I was young, and this was most likely affecting me mentally. We recently moved to a new house on the main street during this time. This town was absolutely decrepit. It was a booming city in the early 1900s, thriving in coal and natural gas production. However, now that those resources have all dried up, this town has a population of around 10,000, is barely surviving off of one company that employs a majority of the town's able-bodied population, And honestly, the house that we moved into was probably older than 200 years old. It was a huge house, and even at the age that it was, I remember wondering how my dad could even afford it, given that we were generally pretty poor. It was 2 stories, had a huge backyard, even had a pond in the back, which seemed strange for a place on the main street. I mentioned that this house was old because very little work had been done to it over the years. The house creaked and moaned with old bones. It was very noticeably old and definitely sounded like it might come crashing down at any second. One Saturday night, I ended up finding myself home alone. My dad was in a garage band, and every Saturday he and his girlfriend would leave at around 6 p.m. and stay out playing and drinking until very early in the morning. On this particular night, my stepsister just so happened to be staying at a friend's house. Therefore, the only living things in that house from 6 p.m. to about 3 or 4 a.m. were my cat and myself. I remember being in the living room watching cartoons on Cartoon Network. I was watching a new show at the time called The Misadventures of Flapjack, and I absolutely loved it. I was already creeped out by the house, and cartoons made me feel just a little bit better. However, I decided to go to bed at around 8:30 or 9, whenever Cartoon Network turns into that Adult Swim stuff. As I reached for the remote to turn off the TV, I heard audible footsteps coming down the stairs. I recognized it spooking me, but I wasn't incredibly terrified because strange things always happened to me in this house. I looked to my left to see the cat sitting on the couch with me. Therefore, I knew it wasn't him walking down the old, noisy steps, mimicking the sound of a human. Although I wasn't necessarily frightened at this point, it was enough to make me stay up and watch some more shows on Adult Swim. About an hour later, I was finally tired enough to force myself upstairs. My bedroom was a square. On the wall opposite the door, there was a window to the center of the wall, and I had a TV on a dresser to the right of it. My bed was centered on the right wall, perpendicular to the window. Opposite the bed wall to the left was a closet, and to the right of that was a green love seat. Now, this closet was very old. The doorknob must have been broken because the door would not remain closed. To make things worse, in the very back of the closet directly facing my bed was a crawlspace. This crawlspace had a piece of styrofoam over it, taped only on the bottom. So when the heat or AC came on, it would cause the styrofoam piece to flap down. I never ended up removing it because I feared entering that closet for some reason. Anyway, because the closet door was always open, and because of the position of my bed, I was almost always constantly staring at this dark hole at the back of my closet. Usually, it didn't bother me, but this night in particular, being home alone, it did. I decided to combat this by closing the closet door and pushing the green love seat in front of it so it couldn't swing open again. I went to sleep after this. That night I had what I think was a dream. I remember having this slightly out-of-body experience. It was like my eyes were positioned right above my head, and I was looking down at my body, while a female hand slowly and calmly made its way down the left side of my torso. I woke up in the morning to something that should have been terrifying, but I feel like if this had happened outside of a dream state, I would have reacted far worse. My sheets and blanket were ripped off my bed and balled up in a pile on the floor in front of me. The green love seat had been moved out from in front of the closet and was now crookedly placed between the right side of the room, as if someone had grabbed the left side, swung it away, and then got out of the closet. The closet door was wide open, and the styrofoam piece on the crawl space had been ripped off. Now, I remember having noticed a pain on the left side of my body, but I never inspected it or gave it any thought because I was more concerned about the state of my room. Later that day, I finally looked at it because I noticed a stinging feeling. I looked down, and I really needed clarification. There were 3 distinct scratches down my left side of my torso, and at that moment I remembered my dream. I hid the story from my dad and never told him my experience because I didn't want to be ridiculed and sent away. I'm open to criticism and thoughts. I would love to know what others think may be going on. My theory is that at the time, due to my young age, I may have been suffering mentally from everything going on in my life, and I may have, without reason, invited something negative into my life. My Bizarre Experience by Stanley. I live in a small community in Northern California with my family and a few neighbors nearby. One morning, about 2 years ago during fall, my dad had gone outside in the morning and noticed someone's bare footprints on the steps in the frost. At first, we thought some thief of the trailer park had come up a few miles down the road and was looking for something easy to steal, but nothing was seemingly missing. My dad put up a trail camera on one of the garden fence posts facing the front door and the steps. We checked the camera 3 days later, and there were many pictures of our dog and people coming in and out. But one picture in particular had a shadowy black figure that looked like a pair of human legs, a torso, and part of a chest and arm. It was strange, and my dad and I somewhat believed in ghosts, but we had never actually seen anything. My dad had some paranormal experiences allegedly when he was younger, but we were both intrigued and slightly uncomfortable as whatever it was so close to our home. We put the camera back up and checked again a couple of days later, and sure enough, there was another picture of a shadowy figure that looked just the same, except this time we could see one with the feet clearly more prominent. It looked like it was barefoot. In this picture, our dog was also standing on the porch, staring right at the figure. We put the camera back up and left it for a week, but never saw the other pictures or any other figures with that picture in it. We did find strange footprints here and there, and it was a bizarre occurrence overall. But that's it. That's about the scariest thing that's ever happened to us in our small community here. Haunted Gas Station by Leia 116. I once worked at a gas station in my town. It differed from what you see today, where they have entire delis, row after row of snacks, or anything like that. This place was old as dirt, and if we had 5 customers inside at once, it would be packed wall to wall. I always had to work the overnight shift there, which meant watching whatever channels the antenna could pick up at the late hour that our tiny little box would work. Usually, I would sit on the corner, smoking cigarettes behind the counter. Yeah, we could do that back then. My boss had an ancient desktop computer set up in the back room for our truck rental business that we ran off the property, and I would like to sneak back there to check my MySpace and a few other sites. I could always hear the bell when a customer came in, and I had direct line of sight to the front of the store from the desk, so it wasn't really an issue. I was even allowed to take my dog with me every once in a while. He was a little corgi. I would often hear noises in the back, but I always chalked it up to my imagination, because it was late at night, and I was sure I was overtired. Well, that changed when I began to bring my dog with me. I would get him right in the back while I surfed the web, and he would always lie down facing away from me. It didn't take him more than a few minutes each night to begin perking his ears up and ruffing under his breath, long before I started to hear anything. Once there were noises I could make out, he would be standing at attention by that point, gazing fixedly into whatever seemed to be thin air. The problem with taking my dog with me was that I would have him walk, and since I felt uncomfortable about going out of the store at night, I only took him a few times. One of the many times he wasn't with me, I was sitting at the computer, and I heard the bell at the front door jingle. When I looked up, I saw what looked like a guy walking in, and I immediately got up to go help them. I stepped into the booth and saw him in the corner at the end of my counter. My view was obstructed by the small TV in the corner and a rather large scratch-off ticket display, so while I could see the arm and shoulder of his black jacket, I couldn't quite see anything more than that. I broke out into a friendly smile and said, "Hello, can I help you find anything?" This was partly because I'm a genuinely pleasant person, and partly because many of our customers tried to steal the Slim Jims and 5-hour energy bottles kept there. I had been asking the owner for months to move them, but he never bothered. As soon as I was done speaking, the man turned to me and my heart dropped. On his right temple, the one that was furthest away from me, was a bullet hole and blood coming out of it, running down his face in a thick, almost black line. I remember gripping the counter and my eyes filling with horror because there was no way this man should have still been standing with something like that going on. I remember his eyes were just filled with sadness and exhaustion. He just left as I was stuttering and reaching for the phone to call 911. he dissipated right in front of me. One minute he was there, the next he was just gone. I tried for the longest time to tell myself I must have fallen asleep somehow and dreamt it, but I don't know. After a few weeks, I mentioned it vaguely to my coworker who relieved me each morning. I didn't want to sound insane, so I asked if she had ever noticed anything weird. That's when she blurted out that calling cards and gift cards often dropped randomly from the display in the corner, and she would hear what sounds like someone walking around when no one was in the store. I finally broke down and told her what I saw, and she laughed and said, "It makes sense," and went on to inform me about a murder that happened a few decades prior. Apparently, a man pulled up to get gas and another man saw him from the street and thought he was someone who owed him money. He peeled into the parking lot and shot him point blank before he could even make it inside to get his gas. He was caught and convicted eventually, but she can't remember any names. She thought the gentleman I saw would probably be the spirit of the person who was shot. And I guess it all makes sense.
So my name is Colton, and I'm a regular guy from a regular small town, and I'm a family man. The year is March of 2020. The entire nation was going through a very unusual, odd, and what could be characterized as downright scary time. I doubt that I need to go into what I'm talking about. I will just say that the word lockdown is no longer a term used just for prisons, even though that's kind of what it felt like at times. My story starts maybe 10 days into the initial lockdown. Let me start by saying that I live in a very conservative state. We have very few restrictions on firearms or your ability to use them. Our state has what is commonly referred to as the castle doctrine, which in a nutshell means if you are on my property and I deem you as a threat, I am within my rights to use deadly force to protect myself, my family, or my property. I will also mention that we have one of the lowest violent crime percentages in the nation, which is why I choose to raise my family here. The reason that I note that before anything else is to impress you on the feeling of safety I have felt here my entire life. Not being safe in my home, or even my own town, has never crossed my mind. That is, until about 3 weeks ago. So it was a Friday night. I would say that it was any normal Friday night, but that was not the case. After 9 p.m. there is nothing, and I mean nothing. Not a car, not a bike, not a person, heck, no noise at all. It's like The Walking Dead minus the zombies. This night we had broken out the board games and Clue was the decided upon game. About 25 minutes into the game, my 16-year-old son bumps my shoulder and asked, "Hey Pop, did you hear that?" I replied, "Hear what, son?" He said that he heard something like a tapping sound, but between me, him, and his 2 sisters and Mom, there was quite a bit of talking and laughing going on. Our house is 2 stories. The family area is in the basement level, which is where we were. Upstairs is the front door and the entry of 3 bedrooms. Maybe 5 minutes later, I hear the same sound that my son was talking about. He says, "See, Dad, look, there it is again." I told him that this time I heard it too, and that I would go up and have a look. I went up the stairs and started towards the front door when I heard a very loud knock. It was like a pounding more than anything. It was coming from the front door, so I decided to go check it out. I stopped in my tracks for a few seconds as I noticed the upstairs lights are off and it is quite dark, even though I know I left them on before I went downstairs. I decided to peek through my blinds to see who was there. My front porch light was tripped, so I knew something had to be there, but I could see absolutely nothing. I do have a security system that has a front door camera, so I retreated downstairs and grabbed my tablet to have a look at what triggered my light and pounded my door. I went back 10 minutes to about the time my son heard the first noise, fully expecting to see some kids messing around. The light came on and the camera recorded the tapping sound, but there was absolutely nothing visually there. The light goes off after 60 seconds of no movement. A few minutes later, the light again comes on and the system again recorded the tapping, but still, there was nothing there. 3 minutes later, the system is once again activated, and this time the pounding is happening again and again. But there is again nothing visually there to clue me in as to what is happening. I thought maybe there was an issue with the video, so I activated all 6 cameras and ran a diagnostic. Everything was seemingly running perfect. My son asked me if he could try something. I said sure and handed the tablet over. He reminded me that these cameras do have a night vision capability. He rewound the video, and then he put on the night vision setting. 2 seconds before the light came on, the camera caught a disturbing image. It was a shape that was kind of transparent and moved without touching the ground, as if it was floating. It moved very quickly and very suddenly. It covered my 50-foot front walkway in about 2 seconds. My son asked me, "Seriously, Dad, what is that?" I told him I had no idea and took the tablet from him and started forwarding it to see the second tapping noise. Now once the light comes on, the night vision feature no longer works, but the light goes off, the feature works again automatically. As I'm forwarding the video, the light goes off, and to my amazement, the thing is still there at the door. It is standing still. Then after 3 minutes or so, the light trips on and you hear the tapping once again, but nothing appears on the camera. After 60 seconds pass, the light goes off, and sure enough, whatever it is still there. Again, it is still as a statue. Another 4 minutes go by and the light comes on and the pounding is heard once more. I waited the 60 seconds, and when the light goes off, the thing is not there anymore. I then activate all 6 cameras on the live feed and pin on the night vision setting. I almost dropped the tab. There in the backyard, looking through a window, is that thing. By this time, my whole family are looking at the screen when all of us realized that the window this thing was looking through was right in front of us. The girls were agitated and scared, and I'm going to be honest, I was a bit worried too. I've never experienced or seen anything like this outside of a horror movie. I gave the tablet to my son and told him to keep an eye on it and let me know if that thing moves. I went to the closet, grabbed my Benelli 12-gauge shotgun, and headed to the back door with my son close behind. I asked, "Is it still there, son?" He replied, "Yeah." I told him to disengage the auto feature on the security light so that when I opened the door, the lights wouldn't come on. I quickly opened the door, stepped outside, and looked out the left of my window. My son said, "Dad, it's looking at you." I yelled, "Who are you, and what do you want?" "It's moving toward us, Dad." Now, I'm not crazy. When I realized I couldn't see this thing with my own eyes, I'm not going to fire my weapon indiscriminately with no visible target. I stepped back inside and closed and locked the door. "It's at the door," he said. My wife is now down the hall asking what in the hell is going on. All I could say is that I had no clue. Then once again, there was tapping on the door. At this point, all I could do was muster a very weak and probably not very intimidating, "You are trespassing. Leave now." Then the automatic security lights come on. All of them. I whispered to my son, "I thought you turned those off." He replied that he did, and that the setting was still off, yet all of them stayed on for quite a few minutes. When the lights finally turned off, the thing was no longer at the door. None of the cameras could see it, and it was apparently gone. All 5 of us stayed up all night watching the cameras. Once the sun came up and my girls went to sleep on the couch, the rest of us couldn't manage to do the same. We just sat there, talking and wondering, rewatching that same 25 minutes of video feed over and over. Some background information before I get started. There is a small town called Alfreda, a little way past Tombstone in Arizona. My grandparents own many acres of land there. They harvest pecans and own about a dozen cows. This land used to be inhabited by Native American Indians. My best friend and I loved to go out and find arrowheads, small bottles, and other cool things of this kind. When I was about 15 or so, we went to visit my grandparents. My mom, my stepdad, my 3 younger siblings, and my best friend Lauren. We got there, said hello, and then everyone went off to do their own thing. Lauren and I decided to go up the mountain and explore some of the old caves that were there. We went up to our usual way and started looking at the holes the Indians used to use for grinding food. There were also exquisite cave paintings. We had only been up there for about 30 minutes or so before we began to feel incredibly uneasy. I felt queasy in my stomach and started to feel like I was being watched. At one point, I felt like I was going to start dry heaving for some reason. We decided to leave right then and there and began walking down to where we parked our 4-wheeler. We were almost there when we heard what sounded like a rock fall off one of the larger ridges above us. We totally freaked out and ran down to the vehicle and sped off as fast as we could. I don't think I've ever ran that fast in my life. I do listen to a lot of scary stories, so I immediately started thinking, and maybe overthinking, that this was some sort of skinwalker or some sort of cryptid chasing us. Lauren did manage to calm me down, saying it was probably just a mountain lion or something like that. We got home and decided not to tell my parents and just to move on. But later that evening, my family all decided to go to the lake. The lake was only about 1.5 miles away, maybe 2 miles from the house at most. You follow a trail that has an orchard on one side and the cow pasture on the other. And once you get about halfway, you must get out and open a gate. So the rest of the trail you're riding in the cow pasture. But on your left side, you're riding up along this fence, and on the other side is just unkept Arizona wilderness. My family left a little before me, but they left me the keys to the other four-wheeler. I left on my own and started the drive. The first half went without incident. However, once I got to open the gate, I heard what sounded like one of our cows. But it wasn't on the right side of the fence. It was on the left side of the fence. There was something off about it, though. It sounded more robotic-like, I guess. I just listened, and the sound eventually distorted into like a scream. This startled me. I threw the gate open and quickly drove through. I had to get out of there, but I also had to get off the thing again and shut the gate. When I did this, I heard that god-awful scream again. It sounded like it was only a few feet away from me this time. I got the fence gate shut. I turned to the fence where I heard the noise, and what I saw scared the absolute life out of me. It was this coyote standing on the other side of the fence, but it wasn't normal. It's like its lips were missing and exposing these incredibly unnaturally sharp teeth. They were jagged and almost misplaced looking. His bones were sticking out of the skin and looked barely draped over its body. Its eyes were pure yellow, as if they were glowing. I stumbled backward and booked it to my vehicle as fast as I could. The thing jumped at the fence, making the most terrifying screech I have ever heard in my life. Its bones cracked when it moved, and this horrible smell filled the air, like rotting flesh and rusted metal. I sped to the lake where my family was sitting, laughing, talking, and just overall enjoying their time. I walked over and took a seat next to my best friend. She immediately knew something was wrong with me. I didn't tell her about what I saw until we were driving back to the farmhouse together. She seemed to believe me. I was so shaken by this that I couldn't sleep at all that night. We left in the morning, and after a few days, I eventually calmed down and felt fine again. I still don't know how I got over it that quickly. It all seemed so unreal in a way, like the feeling you get after you realize a nightmare was only a nightmare. But I know it was real, and I'm just unaffected by it, I believe. I don't know. Sometimes I think that this may have been a skinwalker, but I'm not entirely sure. After some research, I did find out that this area was previously Indian territory. This was the first time I've ever seen one myself, but it was most definitely not the last. I think this thing is hooked on me now. I don't think it's exactly following me, but I do think I've been running into it very often.
Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true small-town horror stories sent in by viewers just like you. As always, if you have a story that you would like to share in a future episode, be sure to submit your story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going on a daily basis. If you enjoyed all of these stories tonight, be sure to slap that like button as it helps me out a ton. The more likes this video gets, the more YouTube promotes it to fresh new eyes, and that helps the swamp grow its ever-expanding waters. If you're new to the swamp and haven't joined us yet, why not subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. I upload videos multiple times a week on all things natural and supernatural, and I'd love to see you here. Down in the comments below, I would love to know what story was your favorite tonight. It helps me pick better stories in the future, and I love reading your reviews. If you're on the go but don't have YouTube Premium but still want to download and listen to your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories no matter where you are, You can download them absolutely free from Spotify, Apple Podcast, and pretty much everywhere else you find your favorite podcast online. If you made it all the way to the end, I'd love to see you commenting the code word, Shining Diner. It's fun to confuse people who don't make it to the end. I love seeing your funny comments. The funniest comment using Shining Diner will be pinned at the top of the comment section per usual. Thank you guys so much for supporting the swamp the way you do. I'll see you all soon with another creepy episode.